Hello everyone, today we talk about the officials in the peripheral administration, essentially of Western Europe during the late Middle Ages or something earlier, starting from the 12th, ending with the 15th century, more or less. I still haven't created properly a medieval government or politics playlist, but I will at some point. I already made lots of videos about these administrative issues, let's say, that some of you may say, oh, it's kind of boring, but actually, or at least I would think so. But I noticed instead that there is an interest, bit mechanistic and kind of even vaguely structuralistic one towards like how did medieval government work, and all these problems, how did they do it, right? It's so complicated. Well, they did it not very differently from in any other age, except for the fact that it was, those means were declined to the ones of the time. So the possibilities of the time, the resources, and so on. So anyhow, it can be an interesting general video starting from these various aspects. I already made videos, by the way, about kind of central government, etc., and we'll make others about that too, and also about this more peripheral aspect. But it's actually a very important topic that would also entail kind of a bit of a premise about what we mean by centralized or not centralized. As you know, the main issue that I have with this definition is that the modernists have tended to monopolize, categorize, absolutize, sclerotize this delusion, frankly, that centralized systems existed only starting from, with the modern state. And this is just an asinine, relativistic, mistake that doesn't have any comparatively. It immediately dissolves because it has no point but by essentially not looking at any other thing but just your own and pretending that it's like that. But I will not digress at least today. This kind of issues, sure, we will talk about them some other point if you dig into the medieval society playlist, especially where there is this kind of content you'll probably find. So starting with the thing, you can say that the construction of a coherent system of offices at a peripheral level was probably the heart of the process of state building during the Middle Ages, as it properly achieved the capillar penetration on the territory of the royal and princely justice and political control, right? The latter subordinated strongly to the former, right? Properly the exercise of justice, who had the right of administering it, and the enormous amount of revenues that derived from that, and which was in fact the most important mean, because as you know, the only foundation and legitimization for a medieval ruler in the West was the fulfillment of the of the first duties properly of a ruler, that is, first of all, safety, public order, stability, without which any civilization cannot even dream to exist, and also, of course, the defense of the pre-existing customs of the communities. And given the chronic political fragmentation of Europe and the world, broadly speaking, at the time, justice was a need, and that could not really be subordinated to much of political of specific interest. It was kind of a broader concern, and even though, of course, the royal and princely intervention locally to exercise justice was often, as we'll see, negotiated, and of course not everybody was particularly happy with that, still any power, also from the bottom, would try to achieve that in a way. So it was always possible to arbitrate all these various communities, controversies. So to say, well, I am the point of reference that you have to look at if I'm powerful enough for this task, right? And therefore, such peripheral administration, because it had to do with properly the entirety of the territory, also the one which the kings or princes didn't have a direct rule originally. And you know that their direct rule started not very differently from than how it started for the other communities, right? These were just the more powerful polities. Could be very different. We will talk about kingdoms, we'll talk about city-states. So this peripheral administration increased for such powers the availability of fiscal resources, given that in theory the territory at some point had been a public domain, right? In Romano-Germanic times, before, or also just in Roman times. But more broadly, and perhaps even more importantly, such connections developed properly an information apparatus, right? A control and mediation system between the central needs and the local interests. That is to say, there was someone going there, right, representing a power on behalf of a sovereign and starting to dialogue with the local communities. And if just for this, you realize there is a work of civilization, because it was a matter of finding a solution, a joint solution that wouldn't make the situation degenerate. Also considering that most of these needs of centralization derived, it is important to say for a military history-based channel, in fact, strategic needs, right? Public security derived also from the capacity of the communities to defend themselves effectively, and or to be cohesive and compact and cooperative with among each other, right? So this political cohesion was necessary to any form of competition also with other powers. So in the field of justice and public order, the gradual increase of the exclusive royal competence for the most serious controversies, the judgments concerning crime, right, and for the appeals as well, imposed the construction of a circuit of judicial offices that wouldn't be limited to grant simply the correct functioning of the traditional judiciary procedures, but that could grant the exercise of royal justice on the entire territory. And as we've seen in terms of political penetration, we're looking just for Western Francia in the 10th century the other day. Well, you've seen that this long-range connections very often were, also sometimes more intense, depending properly on the relevance of the community that you needed to be in touch with, for both interests, right? For receiving this support / legitimization from central authority, and the same for central authority itself towards the, from these other peripheral ones. Naturally, depending again on the broader, balance that would form from the intertwinement or international political interest. So, the extension of indirect taxes, the reappearance of direct forms of taxation, the need to make rapidly and effectively flow the revenues of such exactions in the central trunks, well, these all meant the transformation of the royal patrimonial agents that already existed in the royal domain, as we'll see now, in true and proper territorial terminals of the court. Right? And this happened already way before, always, as we were saying before. There is nothing about what happens, even in the obvious systemic acceleration of this process in the late Middle Ages, that had not been done in the past. Right? Everything had always been working in a way or another like this, right? It's the forces that you have to look at, right? But since, again, materialistic, deterministic, relativistic historiography has wanted us to make us believe it's just a matter of structures, right? And socio-economical issues, right? No, these were just means to an end, and the end was wanted by people that had many reasons to want that in the first place, not just some strange inanimated material ones that nobody would understand otherwise. So this kind of transformation corresponded to a general administrative repartition of the territory, right, with a districtuation, the definition of the areas of competence of the various officials. The administrative districtuation meant thus a radical change in the role of the same officials, right? They weren't just clients of the king in the within the directly controlled territory of the same, but real public administrators of a broader kind of imperial rule. This process can be followed with clarity and unsurprisingly in the Capetian kingdom, where since the late 12th century the definition of a certain amount of territorial prévôt, these were the normal officials, transformed the environment of the sphere of competence of the royal prévôt from let's say a group of rights to a defined territory, right, with a jurisdiction on the inhabitants. Initially, the prévôts would just have an ad hoc employment, right? Somebody called the king, appealed to the king, and so the king sent his officials una tantum to investigate, to have a say, to arbitrate the local disputes. Eventually, the royal prévôt, as we'll see, becomes fundamentally a provincial governor, right? With also a very high degree of power individually and discretionally himself. So this entailed naturally a jurisdiction on the inhabitants, right, on behalf of the king, but de facto administered by these local courts that were provided with, police, power, lands, clienteles, and so on. Eventually, in the 13th century, on the base of such jurisdiction, was developed the adoption throughout all the kingdom of the Norman system of the bailiffs and of the seneschals, because the dukes of Normandy had established an importantly higher degree of centralization in relative terms, for reasons we can't digress on now, but tendentially they had. And it had been enforced further because of the conquest of England, that was not a feudal land, and so where the Anglo-Normans began to centralize more, as you know, just like in Sicily, that we will see also now. So that it was there was a much greater public authority compared to the Western Frankish kingdom. We were saying Normandy late, but when the Capetians take over Normandy, they also adopt this much more centralized system, also because they had become powerful enough to enforce it in part in the rest of France as well. And these bailiffs and seneschals that are very famous in the, especially in 13th century Capetian France, in terms properly of this bureaucracy, what this set of administrators was developing, and they would surpass by far same England in the late Middle Ages. In fact, we will see that, especially after the end of the 100 Years' War, England kind of sort of re-privatized, while France was building like a real state with a real, administration in between the king and also nobility itself. Whereas in England, the nobility was more in charge of the situation. Naturally, both dynamics existed in everywhere, just by different degrees. So, in that moment, this bailiffs and seneschals passed Capetian France for being simple, kind of occasional inspectors into stable government functionaries with an office that could last even several years. And in the following centuries, this government apparatus of the circumscriptions of the district was specialized through the institution of the lieutenants and governors, military captains, advocates, attorneys of the king, that were deputed to also the important financial functions, given that, as we will see now, these people were essentially subcontracting the public rights, right? It had started like that, and so it was a matter of, developing also the administrative side of the financial control to politically direct, let's say, the local government. In the English kingdom, in the 12th century, there was the initial experimentation in the judicial field of a circuit of itinerant royal judges, famously enough, that at the beginning of the 13th century was eventually stabilized through the institution of the so-called keepers of peace. There were professional judges stably settled in defined districts, and in some cases through the development of an intermediate level of administration that would coordinate the already existing districts, by the way, represented a further step in the creation of more effective systems. Because naturally, as we will see now, there was hardly an homogeneity after all, because all these figures still had to be negotiated between the king and the local communities, that the latter already having kind of their own administrative system and autonomies and so on. So it took a long time before it became, like, again, something properly homogeneous, structurally speaking. And such as, for example, in the Sicilian kingdom, where the local camerari, that is the peripheral financial officials, because the camera is in Latin, Middle Ages, it's just like the treasure, right? Was proposed a so-called secret, right? It was the name of the officials, secretum. Or in the French kingdom, were the maîtres de requête, originally officials of the domus regia, so the king's household, began from during the 14th century to constitute the necessary administrative coordination at the provincial level. The Kingdom of Castile used directly the royal agents the royal agents of probably the public demand, or the royal demand, for the institution of a net of royal local representatives by essentially creating a hierarchy on the base of the width of the territorial competences, that were the merinos and the adelantados, that became essentially salaried by the court, and that constituted for a long time the backbone of the administrative geography of the Kingdom of Castile. These same trends could verify starting from the 14th century in the Italian regional states. In the Duchy of Savoy, that at this point was shifting from, as you know, from France towards northern Italy, in Piedmont, there was properly a structure of castellans put together, and these officials were generally responsible for government in districts were different from the ones of the judiciary officials, right, and coordinated by superior officials, the bailiffs, right. So here you have even a superimposition, different layers of officials that control each other, interact with each other, right, and thus also compete with each other, in a sense, developing further the system from the territory locally. The Duchy of Milan, that instead didn't start like the one of Savoy from a feudal base, but from a city, preserved a less uniform system that was, in fact, closer to the originary one of the dominion, say, constituted by subjugating different cities and communes together with their own districts, right? So areas that already had actually an advanced quasi-statal administration, and considered that Milan in this was actually the most state-like in turn of the Italian communal states, as it gradually achieved a higher degree of uniformity. And in this system, in fact, the podestas and the vicaries were appointed by the Duke of Milan, and they became responsible of the government in these peripheral realities, siding the castellans that also, existed, as was plenty of castles around the cities as well. They were entrusted to represent on the military level properly the authority of the prince. And depending on these officials, there were thick groups of assessors, notaries, scribes that carried out also the technical, tasks of government and of administration. So each one of these figures had their own entourage and retinues, right, and following. And monarchies and principalities achieved thus a model of government in which the territory of the state was tendentially covered by the jurisdiction of public officials, right, and articulated in distinguished, kind of separated judiciary, financiary, and military offices. Not unfrequently, however, such separation was not drastic either. And in some cases, officials tended to, for example, sum up all the various functions by realizing a less differentiated system of government that, however, could be more politically cohesive depending on how this concretely happened. So the growth of the territorial dimension of the states and the ever greater, the more capillary, let's say, districtuation implied the continuous increment of the number of officials and their personnel as well. If the Capetian kingdom saw growing between the 12th and 13th century the peripheral officials up to some hundreds, the much lesser territorially extended Sforza Duchy counted in the second half of the 15th century at least 200 podestas. And as you understand, this could depend on the demographic or wealth distribution, the political strategic relevance of these districts, etc. These were apparatuses that tended to administrative uniformity, but that, however, were far from fully achieving it. As we were saying before, not because alleged shortcomings, let's say backwardness of public system, as people think about the Middle Ages compared to the modern statual organizations. This is, again, the modernistic prejudices are probably some of the most radically idiotic concepts that have ever been formulated in the history of mankind. These were in relation, of course, to the peculiar system that contemplated the maintenance of the local government and particular, customs, let's say, other of the local communities, as a system on which the central power was also resting, right? And to which it was essentially superimposing its net of officials. So everything was functional for the possibilities of the time, very often also more than in modern and contemporary times in relative terms. So the new nature of the functions developed by the monarchies on the kingdom's territory implied also a radical change in the nature of its agent. The patrimonial officials of the king, from the English sheriffs to the Capetian prévôt, were prevalently some subcontractors of the royal rights, and that is to say the public rights. And they essentially were doing that for free. Yes, because they managed to get something from it privately anyway. So they would be eventually and gradually compensated by a certain margin, of course, by the revenues coming from the exercise of the office, also by law, by the same royal regulation. So this happened especially because of the increased monetary circulation at some point. So the idea properly of the principle of the official principle of retribution of these agents that were also appointed for defined for certain periods of time on the base of the criteria of fitness, and undergoing also a control on the management of the financial assets of the office itself, right? So retributing directly the officials, and this mostly happened by returning the salary from by the financial figures of the office, meant to institute a relation of clearer dependency from the source of authority that these were called to represent, and it entailed a more stringent duty in the execution of tasks indicated in the instructions contained by the appointment letters that accredited the official as royal representative, and rendering him, let's say, making him participate to the authority of the same sovereign. Or more rarely also, these were fixed properly in the royal administration, as it happened, for example, for the highest territorial functionaries of the Kingdom of Sicily at the time of Frederick II, the provincial justiciaries that were expression of very advanced public culture, as you know, in the Norman Swabian administration. Now, slowly, there was eventually the affirmation of the oath, right, to be sworn, in order to conveniently hold this office, as it happened, for example, for the bailiffs and the seneschals, starting from the end of 14th century France. And the more strict relation with the source of authority expressed by formalized task qualified the official as an emanation of the same authority, essentially placing him under the royal protection, the sauvegarde that the official of the King of France, for example, enjoyed since the 13th century, where they really started to enter prepotently into local affairs, as you know, at the expansion of what was effectively a Capetian empire, up to identifying in the offense to the title holders of the royal offices, of course, the crime of lèse majesty, as it was, for example, contemplated already in the 12th century by the assizes of the Norman kings of Sicily. Framed in this type of relation, the governors, the judges, the financiary officials, recruited, first of all, on the base of a, trust and fealty, personal relation, had, however, to possess some requisites that made them fit to the task of the office itself. Competences were tied specifically to the content of, say, of the office, right? So thus they derived both from the social status, from the education they had uh, achieved. And if the offices provided with jurisdictional and military power required implicitly or explicitly the belonging to the knightly estate, right? And the judiciary offices were reserved to legal experts, right, of different level. Let's say less defined was the preparation required for the exercise of financiary offices, for which in general it was satisfactory to have like a minimal competence in the accounting and writing practices acquired in the exercise of the notary profession or in the mercantile practice. It should be stressed, by the way, that many officials that were generally notaries had their apprenticeship in the seigneurial service, right at the end of their mandate as royal officials. The extension of royal administration offered them vast opportunities, but it did not represent per se an exclusive destination. Various administrative careers could be quite complex and also very remunerative. This shows that, working for a king is convenient, but there are also other convenient offices of that kind of same level, scale of prestige that you may want to get into. So, to the problem of competence, we're also strictly connected one of the correct management of the office itself. The territorial officials were the most sensitive points, let's say, of the royal government. From one side, direct contact with the governance implied the necessity of the knowledge and respect of the local customs, laws, and of the political balance, especially from the other, because they were to play exactly on that kind of superimposition on the or even avocation of local customs by a certain degree. In the Middle Ages, not really, but in part it would happen. It was contemplated. For example, we have seen it in the videos about the legal tradition of the Kingdom of Sicily under Frederick II, from some kind of Norman premises, that there was a faculty of, for example, integrating law where there was some gap, right, in the local customs, by issuing properly some new orders, etc., rules. And from the other side, the management of fiscal revenues had to correspond to criteria that granted also the remunerativity for the crown, because they were, yes, very important offices, but they had a lot of expenses themselves for the local government itself. So from one side, the king wanted to essentially cash from them, but at the same time he had to consider that he couldn't just squeeze too much nor the communities, but nor the officials themselves, who had, as we will see now, in fact, some considerable power themselves, and they would abuse also from their power. In fact, abuses and embezzlement had the double effect of essentially bending, breaking the consensus of the local communities towards the same king, whose official was, however, carrying out mostly this. Well, sometimes it could be both, but let's say these abuses were frequent in a way, as it was a decentralized system still, and of subtracting to the prince financial resources as well, because the local communities were not poor martyrs, angels, like under the tyrant. They were just little tyrants themselves. So all this rendered indispensable a control mechanism. As you understand, this was demanded to a plurality of instruments, from the periodical duty to provide with the financial records, to the central offices right, that were also enlarging as they were to control these various local peripheral administrators to periodical or occasional inquiries, or to formalize procedures of so-called sindicature, that is to say, from the side of mixed commissions of courtly emissaries, for example, and or representatives of the local communities as well, in front of which the subjects could present some accusations on the work of the officials at the end of their mandate, right? So everything was really normally that complicated, and you can understand how much margin there was for any kind of problem, conflict, rivalry to emerge because of all the interests involved and the various actors, protagonists of the same. So the office, let's say, time, the officer terms, right, the professional requisites, the inclusion in hierarchy of offices that were watching the same officials, and other control procedures were thus closely interconnected, in order to provide with the effectiveness of the official's action. In the daily exercise of the office, however, the most strict form of control was the constant connection with the court. In fact, a very thick correspondence assured the transmission of the orders, the carrying out of the royal will, the constant control of the local situations, but it served also to watch over the work of the same officials. Extremely rich archives of correspondence between the court and peripheral officers from the Littere Responsales of Frederick II and of the Angevin sovereigns in southern Italy to the letters of the officers of the Duke of Milan witness how continuous this control was. And the official, after all, represented the king or the prince himself, and he thus had to safeguard the image of the same. There is a very meaningful phrase written by a Sicilian functionary of the 15th century that expressed icastically such necessity by writing to the king, quote, "Your signory cannot be everywhere. It's the officials that make the lords loved or hated," right? Quite meaningful, by saying, bear in mind that we are responsible for this, but that in this sense we also have a power that you do not have, because you can't be everywhere. Very powerful phrase. And this authority representative, very often the same, for example, title of the offices made reference to the quality of procurator of the king, right, of his title holder. The official had to assure the coherence of his work with the virtues of equity and justice connected with royalty, right? So they were becoming kind of kinglets themselves, and it could be a problem. In fact, it was not just even the abuse or the incompetence to provoke hostility towards the royal officials. If, for example, in the period of the creation of such, say, of the institution, the monarchic institutional frames, such officials had represented the point of reference for the also enfranchisement of the emergent estates from the local seigneurial government. Think about the cities and the fact that these officials were very often, in fact, the bourgeoisie, right? In France, they are born like the third estate, fundamentally like that, right? So to advocate like the important decentralized power that the nobility in France had prevented the kingdom to be a unitary thing in the first place, and the increase of the royal prerogatives that translated itself in the emptying of the jurisdiction and the privileges of the communities and of the cities themselves, and the growing necessity from the side of the crown in terms of resources growing had transformed the title holders of the government offices in actually the enemies of the traditional balance of the local politics and society. So the zeal to the advantage of the monarchy was often reason of aversion as much as the abuse of the office at personal ends. Very often the two things overlapped, because still these, as we've seen, these people were paid at the end of the day in say not proportionally but to the income, but they could relatively in fact increase or decrease through their own work, but they had local connections that would make them more or less powerful. I mean, they had the possibility of influencing, especially through justice, I don't know, the amount of land that would end up in the hands of the same public official as a royal one, because it was normal during certain disputes that at some point, I don't know, somebody died without heirs or whatever. Whose land is this, right? And if it's no one's, it's the king's. And so that meant that this local official would eventually rule on a larger amount of land as an outcome of that seizure. So the resistance of the community to the action of the royal officials were translated in the jurisdictional competition, let's say, of the local magistratures, which was a way to because it's not at all, let's say, these officials, as you have understood, they did not substitute the local communities, right? They began to be ever more powerful than them at some level, but equally this could pass through the organization of the local community, right? It was not giving up its own autonomies, right, and could develop its own councils, etc., and influence the same royal official's action. There could also be a simple boycott of the government action, which was particularly effective in the rather not infrequent case when when part of the official's salary, for example, was weighed directly on the communities, right? So they would kind of cut that flow, and at that point it was a problem because, where would the same local official get his revenues from? As we've seen, there wasn't. It mostly derived from the same local resources, but at that point, the fact that the king could rely on many different of these officials all over the kingdom, where there was hopefully not a rebellion everywhere, could provide the same king with the means to back, for example, that specific official and reasserting his power and kind of keeping to, oppressing the local community, keeping them under. And sometimes, however, it was also the direct appeal to the same royal authority, right? Or, for example, in the insistent request to entrust the offices to fit characters coming very often from within the same local communities, which was a very, also a very sensible thing to do, and would have at least from one side, because naturally the official could be interested at that point and make less, but at the same time it could be more aware of the local mechanisms, and so at least a more intelligent and sensitive governor. And there is a mix of all of these at the same time, naturally. So in such dialectic, very often the official didn't was not adequately supported by the authority that he represented, because the necessity of political stability induced the central powers to grant its favor to the requests of the local ruling estates rather than to the ones of its own officials. And this would, of course, erode, however, that public system, except, of course, the local private figures could also be co-opted in the same offices or some other. In fact, that were quite varied, and could be, I don't know, just military ones or other. I don't know. There are many examples. I made videos about, especially the French-English comparison here during the 100 Years' War. It was very, very important for the French king not to say inimitate himself, particularly the local mayors, etc. But he would provide them with important offices, and also having other officials at the same time being elevated to something parallel that could also check one another. I talked about this in the video I made recently about the medieval French nobility, that explains how a great deal of the same gentrification of the knights passed through this, because many commoners were knighted just because they were in charge of some communities or institutions that, by making these people were commoners, were too important for the king to let slip away. So these people would be knighted, very often also bringing to the militarization of the same individual, but still not exactly what traditional knighthood had been about. Many jurists often were knighted because they were considered really that important for the local government and administration, politics, and they had a huge influence also internationally speaking. We were talking about that, especially for the late medieval Italian jurists that influenced, inform a bit the entire Western juridical science through just individual work. And so that could impact even the relation between the papacy and the empire, how power was to be seen and conceived. So there were really many ways, and also through with the rest of politics and society, that the same royal princely officials could interfere, could interact with. Especially from the 14th century, when more stringent were the necessities to negotiate with the peripheral realities because of the big economic and demographic contraction of Eurasia, and thus also the kind of shrinking of the over lordships, let's say, on great territorial realities. Just think, especially about the most important example is France. It is huge, and it's also starting to fall apart because of the 100 Years' War. So you really have a more pressing need to listen to the local communities, not to let them slip away, right? And this naturally was due to the fact that the monarchy had growing needs in terms of need to receive financial support, and especially through extraordinary impositions, right? Especially consider war again, and the delegation of the management of politics to the local elites thus represented in that specific moment even actually shrinking, withdrawing of the capacities of the authority to exercise in a regular way through its own apparatuses and personnel the actual power. So there are lots of backs and forths. Indeed, the greatest moment of, let's say, the peak of public culture in medieval Europe is the 13th century. Not that during the late Middle Ages there weren't kind of central apparatuses that reinforce themselves exactly from the within, but that's because the pre-existing bases had shrunk, right? And so they were obliged to have a greater public authority, but locally, because also the local communities were more willing to give power to that smaller power. But the larger power in absolute terms had been before, right? That's the same reason why at this point, again, I don't know, the Holy Roman Empire, the Germanic power withdraws, and they don't make, I don't know, Italian expeditions anymore. Why the various, I don't know, for example, the southern Italian kingdoms tend to privatize ever more, with baronial rule to rise. That's why, again, France is in a bit of a panic. And there are different moments. The same Scandinavian monarchies suffered an important contraction, and also foreign domination, especially through the German mercenaries that took over all these kind of governmental roles, which is a very underrated chapter in medieval history. And the partial correction of this dynamic was the ever more frequent use of extraordinary officials as well. So these were men provided with wide jurisdiction, sometimes also, exercising brute force. Think about some military officials like the Guesclin, etc., during the 100 Years' War. So also the civilian and military functions were coming back to blend by a certain degree, and that were given such extraordinary powers exactly because the same central power couldn't pay them otherwise. So they left them free hand, given that the ordinary officials at this point were scarcely incisive or inadequate because they lacked resources themselves, and creating also this system of kind of seigneuries within the same state. And the resistance that the communities opposed to the commissaries, special procurors, and similar functionaries that were fundamentally extraneous at that point to the consolidated institutional frames was radical. The people did not like them at all because they simply entailed the loss of their freedom, that at some point, however, was also necessary. Because what do? Right? Think about the rebellion of Paris during the 100 Years' War, where also that internal asset was for undermining the French monarchy to make the English coming in and hoping in a kind of the centralized position of Paris, or at least one that they would capitalize on the short term. That's disruptive, and it's something that at the end of the day doesn't work because it was counter. It was just damaging the entirety of the system for the benefit of a very few. Right? It's just like today, people who have states that work and that back kind of enemies, or states that are also less strong than that these same people from within other countries would make them be, just because, I don't know, they don't understand much about the international situation, or think that, voting against a politician in their own country, is, and supporting a foreign power is kind of a positive thing for the country to live in, and they can't distinguish the thing anymore. That's just plain stupidity. In any case, there was a difficulty of consolidation of the extraordinary government practice that also, in fact, brought the same monarchies to, at the end of the day, to take other roads. First of all, the one of the cooptation of the local ruling estates in the royal offices itself. Right, so that is actually the way, and unsurprisingly, for some of the larger powers like France, that also suffered some of the biggest blows. The system did not collapse exactly because there had been that previous base on which the monarchy could keep expanding further. Other powers, even maybe more successful in relative terms at a point, but still kind of, shrank back again into the background. Looking at these other states eventually taking off during the modern age, but for the same reason. So a temporary weakness doesn't mean that just there aren't some other dynamics that simplistically you could simply think, well, the system is going down. Well, it can go down all the time, but at the end of the day, it's whether it will go down or not that will make the difference, not just wishful thinking. And at the end of the day, people tend to stick to the system that gives them enough stability to go on. So even this idea of loss of liberty that does happen in the late Middle Ages potently compared to any modernistic myth of humanism and the Renaissance at all. It's the Ancien regime that crystallized itself, but it was also a necessity of the times, right? And the system kept expanding through that. And two subsequent tendencies could verify, in fact, in the recruitment of the officials. One posed to the guarantee of impartiality, the externality of the official to the government district, and the explicit prohibition of routing as it was prescribed, for example, by the Constitutiones of Frederick II for the Kingdom of Sicily. Another privileged the recruitment of the representatives of authority among the members of the local elite, with the aim of granting the consensus of the administrated communities. The local magnates selected and invested of royal authority in the base of fealty and the fitness relative to the office tasks ensured the maintenance of the consolidated balance of the communities and found in the royal office new opportunities to strengthen their preeminence on the local level. This second tendency was coherent with a policy that tended to privilege the achievement of consensus compared to the financiary and judiciary rigor, let's say, and it derived from the impossibility of the royal powers to extend everywhere the direct authority. And the involvement of wide sectors of the local ruling estates in the royal administration had the effect of making, let's say, a political society emerging that at the existing and to the consolidation of the royal power owed the reasons of its own existence. And this was naturally happening again between the 14th and the 15th century, when the ruling classes were essentially becoming the ever more privileged ones where the middle classes were kind of being worn out, and the peasants also were going under. And so the monarchy as the super elite, let's say, the overlord, would crystallize its own control on the communities through these already very powerful individuals. That thus would be properly the various elements of this broader machine, right? That would make mostly work the wall and beat the wall through various offices, titles, exemptions, and so on. And in fact, besides the title holders of the government offices, in fact, was a multitude of other subjects that was, as retinues, fundamentally involved permanently or occasionally in administrative tasks. For example, tax collectors, judges, collaborators, temporary, say, individuals who were temporarily entrusted with specific tasks relative to, for example, the defense, like military emergencies. And these all belonged, in a sense, they were de facto of the local elite already. They lived under them already. And they were habituated to work a bit in the same field. So the development of the monarchic government in this time did not happen thus above the same realms communities, but let's say at that point involved them entirely within their ruling class through the local government system that was by itself already taking kind of that monarchic direction. And all of this making actually the states ever more functional, ever more powerful, ever more controllable than ever before, in fact. And this is evident as still, again, medieval civilization emerged from the crisis anyway by strengthening power, right? So even if, the output was less overall, but still the political unity in relative terms it was achieved in the late Middle Ages, that was greater than ever had ever been seen in the medieval millennium, right? In terms of direct control, etc. So this is crucial because you understand that eventually Europe took off still in a moment in which, again, the ancien regime had fixed this system and made things work through it, and there was no coming back. And the state has ever more strengthened ever since. So the advantages deriving from the royal office, after all, were many. Consider this: the office became the mean to social affirmation in their local realities, or as a starting point for long-term career in the royal peripheral administration, and for the circulation of local, let's say, within local and central realities that were ever more intertwined. Often, the peripheral office was in fact a sort of apprenticeship itself for taking on some government responsibilities at court, right? Part of this broader ladder from the province to the top, which also brought the local communities to compete for the unity of the system to remain, because they would have had prospered within it, and the traditional establishment that had gravitated around the court at this point was also, I'd say, populated by individuals that were ever more motivated to kind of surpass them in a sense, and through this bringing their, I'd say, their provincial realities closer to that court and to, betting on it, right, and not on its disgregation. And this is still very important because there were, just speaking of these kingdoms that also emerged from national realities that took over others, especially France, but there are other examples as well. What you have is kind of a national traditional high nobility that doesn't like at all the parvenus, even more when they are actually coming from peripheral realities that had never been so powerful as them, especially as noblemen. I mean, think about southern France for the court of Paris, right? There had never been such powerful noblemen in the south like in the north. But now it was crucial to control this area. It was still difficult, by the way. Like at the end of the Middle Ages, don't think that, even if you talk about a kingdom like the one of France, or even in the case of England, you can't say, well, this politics have like a, territorially, like they're established and therefore like they're going to remain the way they are. Actually not. They were still pretty mobile and kind of unstable in a sense. So it was really a challenge also to still strengthen the ties with them. So consider, in fact, that the coming from the same local communities, or the relations that through such origin, the officials entertained during their mandate caused their transformation in protectors of the community rather than in agents of royal will, right? It's as if, again, the community after the 14th century crisis had strengthened also within the same boundaries, and so as we've seen at that point, the monarchs had given up the idea of having just an average guy, maybe a very brilliant, skilled administrator, but sent there and gradually acquiring power on his behalf. No, it was these communities still de facto being autonomous, right? Autonomously governing themselves, and just being stratified in a way that would make it easier for the sovereign just to talk with, say, that single guy as, you know, a spokesman for the entire community rather than lots of different communities. And this, again, it had happened also as an internal mechanism of the same communities, independently from this kind of royal administrative changes. So this would naturally proliferate some kind of practices and trends and customs that were also in part not necessarily obstacling the royal the royal, as we've seen, the unity of the kingdom in itself, but still allowing certain dysfunctionalities that the king couldn't really have a control on, right? Because not necessarily these were particularly bad. Maybe they went again in favor of this further cooptation because it would make the local rulers more powerful at the end of the day. But still kind of being that community and not being so easily controllable in a direct way from the king, right? So here could kind of digress on how various countries eventually compacted in the way more or less at the end of the Middle Ages we see, but culturally and etc. And so there are many other factors involved in this compaction. It's never like, again, a structuralistic, mechanicistic process. It's like ideas and beliefs and lifestyles and, you know, how these people saw the world that really made the difference in many ways. And generally speaking, humans understand that a functional government is more effective than just people pretending that being absolutely free has anything to do with being able to do anything with that freedom, which is a huge topic, as basically old world civilizations that accomplished the greatest feats always needed a state to work, right? So that's also maybe in itself a shortcoming, but it's a shortcoming of a complexity that still cannot be handled differently in order to succeed in absolute terms against other systems, which happens all the time. And in fact, the most successful countries would be the ones that had maintained a greater unity, after all, right? Considered in the early modern age, you have essentially still the emerging powers are the ones that had a pregress monarchic tradition, a pretty solid one, right? Elective monarchies eventually in the second modern age didn't make it. They remained hopelessly fragmented. It's countries like England, like France, like Spain that had that kind of power, right? So the identity of the functionary thus swung between the identification with the princely policy, the pursuit of the interest of the community where he came from, and in which he maintained and strengthened his own roots, in the way we have just said. And so, searching for personal or familiar profit, for example, and this speaks basically of the Ancien regime and how it evolved at that point. But always remember that it happened from an important contraction of the system that we tend always to neglect, because we have this kind of idea of linear progress, or at least some sort of let's say of this, I don't know, there is an absolute standard over which every variable let's say goes the same direction and same speed at the same time. It doesn't at all. And paradoxically, was this kind of loss of individual liberty, considering the broader population, that brought to the stabilization of a system that still took off remarkably in the centuries to come. And you can, and there had been a massive also kind of macroscopic material loss in this. Like, it wasn't just the same people. After all, population of Europe after Black Death had really fallen, so the economy had contracted. So this system was a necessity, and it would pioneer that growth that paradoxically would unhinge it still from a more democratic base. In any case, later on in the late modern age, in the contemporary era, as a matter of fact. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.